We'll give people 5 minutes to gather. I managed to vent my spleen. I needed a couple more 21-year-old citizen journalist girls to spew my poison out, but I couldn't find them, so I'll have to make do with the ones I've abused. Oh, here we are. Okay, so record space. You can record in the spaces feature when you start. Oh my god. I don't know. I think I'm going to have to let them down here. I don't understand what this means.
I'm sure if someone else was happy to, they could surely screen record on their phone or whatever device they're using and send you that.
It's rather impolite not to do it myself now that I promised, but I just can't. I should have prepared beforehand. I just can't. I think I'd have to go. I think I'd have to close the space and open it again to do it, and I don't want to do it. I hate to let the guy down, but give me 2 more minutes. Maybe I can work out record space.
One of the most.
Space. The problem is all the instructions on my version of Twitter that I downloaded 15 years ago, and then left the account dormant for 12 years. They're all in German. So
Alex, I've just looked into it. You need to enable the record space feature before the space begins, I'm afraid.
okay.
So if you did want to do this, you'd need to restart the space.
Yeah, no, I don't like to let the guy down, but I don't want to. Everybody's come in. I don't want to kick everybody out again, and I'll just have to. If anybody does have a recording device, it's not for my sake. I mean, I don't care whether it's recorded or not, and I really don't.
Stop talking about me, Jose.
Please, if any of you have an easy to hand recording device and can easily record, please do so, because I promised this guy, what's his name, Nanas, who's in California. It's like 5 o'clock in the morning there now, so he can't listen. I promised I'd record for him. Anyway, I'm sure it's not going to break his heart one way or the other. But if anybody wants to make a recording for Nanas, please do. So let's start. I'm trying to do these earlier in the day, but at my age, frankly, even 3 o'clock, I'm feeling a bit shagged out. But I won't make excuses in advance. I feel I could be doing better than I'm about to do, but I suppose I'm just making excuses for myself. It's a tricky job because I don't want to bore you by reading out a prepared text. I want to extemporize and improvise, and you really have to be mentally on your toes to do that. And I think the best time for me to do something like this would be 9 o'clock in the morning when I've just had my coffee. So anyway, I'll give it a try now in mid-afternoon, and we'll see how we get along. As I say, I'm not going to bore you by preparing a text and reading it out. I mean, you can do that on Substack. So let's get into it. I'm doing this. I was requested, not exactly requested, but it was at Esther Hazer, or Esther. What is it? I don't know how you pronounce your name. Esther Hazy, Esther Hazer. Esther Hazer's suggestion, because I believe he's reading Elementary Particles at the moment, Houellebecq's second and probably his definitive novel. But I immediately said I was very happy to do it because Houellebecq is I think it's safe to say, the only living novelist that I feel the kind of love and esteem for that I feel for the great novelists of high modernism of 100 years ago. I say he's living. I believe that I haven't. It's really only his early work that engaged and captivated me, and I've read and reread. I've barely read his work since about 2000. The only novel I made an exception for was the one that really made history, as it were, as a political event rather than a literary event. Submission, of course, which was published just before the terrible year of 2015 in France that began with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and the Bataclan took place in the autumn, and he somehow survived that year, although right at the beginning of it, or I think maybe in the last weeks of 2014, he published not exactly an attack on Islam, but a dystopian novel. I think it was gently dystopian, about the Islamic takeover, the democratic Islamic takeover of France. So I read that because it was in constant discussion in 2015. But I stopped reading his work after about 2000, mainly because Houellebecq is a very honest man. He follows the most basic rule, I think, of a good writer, which, as you all know, is write about what you know. Very few novels that attempt to, it's often been attempted, but a 21st century German attempting to project himself into the life experience of a Egyptian slave girl in 3000 BC, short of astonishing genius of
This electric
so,
guard
WNBA
champion can drop dimes from all
like
over
all,
the court,
fact,
from the New York Liberty, Natasha.
The three great modernists for me are Booth, Joyce, and Kafka.
A former Indiana Miss Basketball who is making her 7th WNBA All-Star game appearance this weekend from the Seattle Storm, Skylar Diggins.
At the end, it's going to say, but literally
also representing the Seattle Storm, she was the 2019 All-Star Game
in Ulysses. We have two
Welcome back to
a young
Indiana,
version,
Erica
it's basically
Wheeler,
more or less copies from Truth.
and a 3-time WNBA All-Star, who is the defending champion of the Kia Skills Challenge from the
So Houellebecq is stuck to that road, really, and that means that his life altered radically.
Let's hear it one more time for the participants in the Kia WNBA Skills Challenge.
Extension du domaine de la lutte, extension of the domain of the struggle, in 1994. And then his great success, his breakthrough novel, Elementary Particles, Particules Élémentaires, in 1998. And that changed everything for him. I think the first novel, Extension du domaine de la lutte, which is a story of a small kind of lower to middle level software engineer in a software company of some sort. I don't know what the terminology is exactly. I know nothing about software. Earning moderately well, but extremely lonely, depressed, sexually frustrated. That was pretty much his life. He was unknown, almost completely anonymous, not particularly rich, and probably did, although he's been married 3 times. So he married very early and divorced very early, then married again. I think in the 90s, he was more or less in the position of the protagonist of Extension du domaine de la lutte. Then in Particules Élémentaires in 98, you have again, he kind of splits himself, as Joyce does with his self in Ulysses, into Michel and Bruno, the 2 protagonists, but he's more Bruno than Michel, I think. Michel is a bit of a construction or a projection. Bruno is basically himself. Bruno is also a middle-class, mid-range earning and deeply sexually unhappy man. In Bruno's case, in Particules Élémentaires, he's not a software engineer, but a lycée teacher, or a teacher at some kind of secondary school in the suburbs of Paris. And this is all pretty much, an experience of relative poverty, anonymity, but above all, social and sexual failure. After 2000, of course, this completely changed. Houellebecq became a celebrity. He made a lot of money. And because he's a fundamentally honest man, I think, he wished to, he didn't wish to artificially force himself to write about an experience he was no longer having. And most of the protagonists of his novels, all of them, I'm not that familiar. I've half read a few of them since, but they all of the protagonists of his novels seem to be of a much higher social class. They have a lot more sex. The protagonist of Possibilité d'une île, the possibility of an island, is some kind of very successful cabaretiste, sort of stand-up comic of some sort, some kind of TV comedian. The protagonist of Submission is a university lecturer, an expert on Ismo. Theme is not really an issue for Houellebecq in his novels after 2000. I mean, sex is still a theme, but the fundamental problem of the first two novels, it just is put in abeyance largely. It's no longer his problem. I mean, the really interesting problem about what made the first two novels unique largely is, I mean, it's quite common for the search for love to be a theme addressed in European literature. It's addressed in many novels throughout the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. But the basic search for sex, the basic inability to fulfill this animal need, this basic animal need, had hardly been touched on in literature before that. And Houellebecq was the first to do so. But anyway, this is all a preamble. I don't want this to go on for 2 hours or 3 hours. It may well go on for close to 2 hours, but if you can stand it. So I'll try to stick to the plan. The best way to start, I think, because I don't want to, I mean, I try to make this a bit anecdotal and autobiographical because it's boring otherwise, I will begin by describing my own first, I mean, as I say, Houellebecq he's a unique case for me because he's the only living author that I have the kind of relation to that I have to Proust, Kafka, Joyce, the great authors who died decades before I was born. The only living author for whom I have a comparable degree of esteem. And it's quite interesting, the story of my first encounter with him. I think I was given a copy of Elementary Particles a couple of years after it came out. I think it must have been an English translation, must have been the first edition of the English translation, by a really sort of hipstery sort of girl I knew in London. And in those days, to my shame, I have to admit, I sound like, I probably am at my age, a very intellectually independent-minded and rather arrogant individual. But in those days, I was already well into my 30s by then, I was completely under the intellectual sway of someone I'd studied with, someone slightly older than me, someone I'd studied with in Germany, whom I kept in very close contact with, telephoning every week, who basically dictated to me, certainly in terms of literature, my taste. And he was massively more well-read than me and kept up religiously with all the latest publications. He was a reader of what are called feuilletons in German and in French, and in English are called cultural supplements. I mean, he'd work his way through the cultural supplement of the Frankfurter Allgemeine and Le Monde and the London Review of Books and the New York Review of Books. He'd know everything that came out, everything that was new, and he always formed a very strong opinion on it. And what affected my reading of Houellebecq was that he had formed immediately, possibly without having read Houellebecq, because he was even more arrogant than I am, a very negative opinion of Houellebecq, which was actually understandable in 1998, 1999, because as happens with many authors, Houellebecq could, you just become flavour of the month or flavour of the year. After the publication of Elementary Particles, he really was. I don't know what it was like in France. I wasn't in France at the time, but even in Britain, he was everywhere. He was on the cover of every magazine, and there were newspaper articles and TV shows about him. So my friend Hendrik in Germany had really formed the idea that he was what he called a Modeautor, a modish author, someone who would just be extremely famous and just vanish, just sink without trace a year or so later. And it's easy to think that about Houellebecq, because also, you know, he was a very controversial. I mean, I think it's a mistaken opinion to have of him, but he did attract controversy. This is something that often happens with people. Someone who you see it with political commentators, people like Katie Hopkins or even Tucker Carlson or someone like this. People constantly accuse them of being provocateurs, usually completely wrongly. I mean, most people who provoke. Some people, I suppose, there are people who deliberately think up opinions. There are several people like that on X, on Twitter. I think I posted about a couple of them, like this Owen Benjamin guy. It's another one, zigs when Twitter zags and zags when it zigs, specifically in order to provoke and to be contrarian. But people are often accused of this, Katie Hopkins, Tucker Carlson, hundreds of others, and I don't believe they do it. They simply say what they feel, they write what they write. And if people are provoked, well, it's up to them. I think it's certainly the same with Houellebecq, but he did cause tremendous controversy. For example, the big literary prize that Elementary Particles won was actually called the January Prize, I think it was called, or something. Which the man who provided the prize money immediately resigned when the jury decided to give the prize to Houellebecq, and they had to change the name of the prize to the December prize or something. And this constantly happened, and it did give the impression, given all the constant fodder, the constant nourishment that Houellebecq's career was providing for the newspapers, the TV talk shows, and so on, that he was deliberately aiming for notoriety and provocation. I don't think it was the case at all. But in any case, my friend Hendrik had decided that he was a deliberately provocative, deliberately scandalous, superficial, and sort of basically overnight sensation kind of author. But it really wasn't, there was absolutely no point in paying any serious attention to him. And I took over this opinion, as I did with all of Hendrik's opinions at the time actually. And I had this experience, much like, to tell another literary anecdote. I don't know if there's another novel some of you may have heard of or read, by a man called John Kennedy Toole, an American from the southern states, who wrote one novel, a novel he worked on very hard. He couldn't find a publisher for it, and he committed suicide at the age of 31 because he couldn't get his book published. And his mother then took it upon herself as a mission to get her son's masterpiece published. And she went around pressing various people, annoying them to read this very large book, this very large manuscript. And there's one writer called Walker Percy who tells the story in a very funny way about how, you know, it's very difficult to turn down a grieving mother when you're personally acquainted with her. And he sat down very reluctantly to work his way through this 1,000-page manuscript, expecting it to be, I mean, the only person who recommended this book to him was the guy's mother. He didn't expect it to be worth his while. And he wrote, I think I wrote this passage down, actually. It's quite amusing the way he writes about it. I read on. He said, I was looking, as often happens when I'm asked to read manuscripts, I was looking for a sentence or a paragraph that would be bad enough to give me the excuse that I could give myself, my own conscience, to say, okay, I'm sorry, I can't be expected to do this, and throw the thing aside. But he writes here, I read on and on, first with a sinking feeling that it was not bad enough to quit, then with a pricket of interest, then a growing excitement, and finally an incredulity. Surely it was not possible that it was so good. And this is exactly what happened with me and Elementary Particles, when I read it in 1999, 2000, a couple of years after it came out. I went to it really just with the intention of gathering some little snippets I could snigger and sneer with Hendrik on the telephone about, and how pretentious a man was, and how cheap and vulgar he was. And at first I found a couple. I interpreted them in a very bad faith way, and really just was as grudging towards them as possible, and wrote them down in the expectation of being able to sneer about them. But as I read on, I just came across so many passages that were of such glowing purity and sincerity, and the pathos and the truth of everything, and the profound importance of everything that was said in the novel. Just by the end, I just even the first phone call with Hendrik, I think I almost quarreled with him. I was almost angry with him that someone could possibly conceive of this novel as a just a piece of fluff or just a piece of foam on the waves. I mean, now I'm thinking to myself, has he read it? So I don't know if we ever came to an agreement about that. But anyway, to give you some idea, I'm going to go on. I'm sorry to talk so much about myself, but I find it actually helps in these matters. It lends some kind of authenticity and depth to what I'm saying. So, I mean, to explain my reaction, I think you need maybe a bit of background. It's personal autobiographical background, but it's also general literary history, which some of you may not be familiar with. I don't know how much of a general education in the history of European literature you have collectively. I mean, I'm sure it's different in the case of each one of you. So anyway, I'll go into it on my own. I don't hold any degrees in literature. My degrees are in languages, but with a specialty in history and politics, really within the language, and in philosophy. But I've read a lot of literature, and most of my reading actually has been done off the curricula of whatever institution I was enrolled at the time. So I've done a lot of reading in various languages, and the center of gravity of my own literary interest, as I mentioned earlier, lies, I think, in high modernism. I mean, the great trinity of saints of literature for me are, as I said, Joyce, Proust, and Kafka, all writing in the 20s, basically, in the period just after the First World War, or just during the First World War and just after it. Or just before, and the period 1900 to 1930, let's say. And I'd read pretty much all of the works of all of these men by the end of my 20s, let's say. And I remember making an effort. This would have been about 1990. We'd be coming out at the end of the 80s. And I remember, feeling I was under an obligation, and I remember making an effort to extend. Because all these men were dead. Joyce was the one who died last, and he died during the Second World War. Kafka died in 1924, 25, I think. Proust around the same time. So I felt all of the preceding 50 years of literature between their deaths and the time I was living, the 70s, the 80s, I really hadn't succeeded in establishing a relationship with anything that was written during that period. So I did make an effort. I mean, those of you who browse Poll a lot, I imagine a lot of you are sort of 4chan people. I hope you are. Anyway, I hope you're bleeding Redditors. So those of you who browse Poll will probably have formed an idea. I mean, you can get a fairly good idea of the sort of image that a young, smart, hip, internet savvy kid. This is the impression I get of the young, smart, hip, internet savvy kid. Anyway, the impression that he or she has formed of 20th century literature. You can see this from the lit threads. Did I say Poll? I meant lit. You can see this from the lit threads on 4chan. You've got kind of three waves. You've got the really at the center of each of which is some author of a special difficulty and or a pair of authors of a special difficulty and a special importance. The first one, as you know, if you look at lit, there's 4 or 5 every time you browse the place. Or back when I browsed it, there were 4 or 5 simultaneous threads on Joyce and Ulysses. So the first sort of focus of interest is around 1920, 1930, and James Joyce, Ulysses specifically. That's the first wave, as it were. I mean, there is Kafka and Proust as well, but I think for an English, an Anglophone board, for an English-speaking community, Joyce, obviously, the Anglophone among those authors, is the main focus of interest. So there's the 1920s, 30s, and Joyce. Then you have your second wave between 1960 and 1970 coming along. the central figures of which are Nabokov and Pynchon. And finally, at the time that I was browsing Pol, which would have been in the 2000s, there was a huge concern, interest, obsession with David Foster Wallace, of course, who will be the last wave of the 20th century, actually going on into our century. I don't know if there are others, but the really central figure seemed to be David Foster Wallace. And Infinite Jest, there was always a thread on that novel or on David Foster Wallace in general. And he does represent this last surge of the last great writer in English of the 20th century. So I don't know. To be honest, I've never read Wallace, so at least I made an attempt to read David Foster Wallace and failed completely. I think I gave up after about 10 pages. I think I was prompted by Lit on 4chan to do so, and I just gave up. Now, there's one, you probably had similar experiences, or you will, with time. There's one fairly prosaic and shaming and shameful explanation for that, which is envy. Personal, it's a psychological explanation. It's personal envy. It's the principle of a prophet is never honored in his own country. And David Foster Wallace, chronologically speaking, very much comes from my country, as it were. I mean, if he lived, we'd be about the same age. I think he'd be. I think if he was still alive, he'd be 64 or something now. So a couple of years younger than me. Of course, he committed suicide at 45 or something. But that will be one explanation. You don't like. It hurts emotionally. It hurts one's pride to find oneself developing the kind of almost religious adulation that I developed for Kafka or Joyce or Proust, whom I could look on, and to use this phrase of Dylan Thomas's, as the towering dead. I mean, they're almost in another realm. You don't compare yourself with them really, because they were living under different historical circumstances. You can invent the excuse for yourself that, well, if I'd lived in that world, if I'd lived in that era, then maybe I would have been able to do what they did. But in the case of someone like David Foster Wallace, who was born pretty much in the same year as me, I'd have to work pretty hard to find an excuse. If I had developed this admiration and this great emotional investment in him that I did in Joyce or Proust or Kafka, I'd have had to find good reasons why I couldn't do anything even remotely approaching what he did. So that will be one explanation, and that's the more the more shaming and the explanation that's least flattering for me. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just looking for a way out there, an escape from this explanation. But I think one thing that pushes me towards another explanation for why is the fact that the fact is I failed in terms of the three waves that I talked about, not at David Foster Wallace in the 1990s or around 2000, but in the second wave. I've never been able to read. Well, I mean, I've read Pynchon. I've made attempts to read Pynchon, but I can't say I've ever gotten to the end of even of the shorter of his books. Nabokov is such a towering figure that I've read Lolita, I've read some of his books to the end, but there too, given the man's importance and given the number of books he wrote, it's quite shameful in comparison to the depth in which I entered into Proust or Kafka, how little I've read of him. So I mean, it's the more flattering explanation, really. Maybe the reason why I stalled, as it were, around 1945 and cannot establish, or until I encountered Houellebecq, I was not able to establish any kind of really vital and authentic relationship to the literature of the last 100 years, is because in 1945, literature, not just English literature, but the literature of all European nations anyway, did undergo a fundamental qualitative change. You'll all be familiar with this. It's known as the turn from the modern to the postmodern. Joyce and Proust. The Joyce of Finnegan's Wake he pushed so far into the avant-garde that you can classify him almost as the first postmodernist, even though Finnegan's Wake was written before the Second World War. It really is a precursor for a lot that came after, right up to the present day. But the main body of Joyce's work, the main body of Proust's work, the main body of Kafka's work is decidedly modernist, in the sense that it's concerned with the attempt to represent reality, not necessarily directly, but ultimately it's the faith in the possibility of, as I said, in the case of Joyce and Proust, we're really just almost talking about writing down. There's very little invention in either of them. I think Joyce actually says so. He was extremely reluctant to invent anything. This is why he was constantly having maps of Dublin and Dublin almanacs and Dublin newspapers and real artifacts from Dublin, preferably, ideally, from the Dublin of the period he was writing about, in 1906 or whatever, sent to him in Zurich or in Paris or in Trieste. He did not. He did not conform at all to this vision of the artist as someone who sits in a tower and these fairies and serpents and devils are just bursting out of his head. He's inventing as he goes. It was a painstaking reconstruction of actually experienced events. Postmodernism is something entirely different. There, the attempt to all the doubts about the possibility of representing reality in a way that the subject, the individual writer, does not distort and color and render unrecognizable through his or her own prejudices or point of view. That's been completely given up after about 1945. Literature has become painfully conscious of itself as literature, as fabulation, as invention. This is a fundamental difference. For those of you who know David Foster Wallace, of course, you may be thinking, well, wasn't Wallace trying to get away from all that? He was. By the 90s, that had become so universal. This idea, well, a book is not a representation of reality. A book is a book. A book is a fiction. A book is a construction. So let's just recognize that and play with that idea and recognize that all we're doing is juggling with signs and symbols. And by the time Wallace came along, he was just sick. Everybody was sick to the teeth of that. And he made an attempt to break back through to authenticity and direct representation. I don't think he got anywhere near succeeding, but we can talk about this. Am I losing track here? I'll just, before actually coming to Houellebecq, I'll say just a little more about that. I've got to qualify that to some extent. We're talking about the period 1945 to the time when Houellebecq arrived, the 90s, so that 40, 50 years. What I've said, it applies to any characterization of any literary period, really. The only people who fully represent the model that I just described, this reduction of literary creation to a game with mirrors, a game with signs, a kind of juggling trick, which is acknowledged to have no relation to anything that actually exists in the world outside the book. Very few authors actually do fully instantiate that. The ones who do have largely been forgotten now. You probably never heard of people like John Barth, for example. He was hugely popular in the 60s. He wrote this large, sort of very strange, kind of fantastical, multi-layered novel called Giles Goat Boy. He published a collection of short stories which pretty much sums up the spirit of postmodernism, Lost in the Funhouse, which is an image of games with mirrors, someone lost in this kind of artificial world where you find yourself in a room which has a distorting mirror which shows you a twisted image of yourself, and you find there is actually no self. Your self consists entirely of these different distorted images of a thing which doesn't exist. And this is the whole postmodern world. And Barth represented this perfectly and vanished more or less without trace. I believe he died last year, but he hasn't published anything that anyone's read for about 40 years. Hadn't published. The one I mentioned, Nabokov, and the other one, whom I haven't mentioned, Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian, neither of them actually, they are such giants that even though they are recognized as the patron saints, as it were, of postmodernism, just as Kafka or Proust or Joyce will be recognized as the patron saints of modernism, they don't really conform, or they conform and don't conform at the same time to the description that I gave. I mean, the Borges in particular is just someone who is a very conscious creator of fictions. He never wrote novels. He wrote these tiny constructions which compressed hundreds of ideas into 4 or 5 pages. He seemed not to be working. He seemed to be a fabulous artificer. He deliberately called his main collection of short stories fictions, just as it were, as if we were pushing away any imputation of realism or naturalism or any attempt to represent reality. They're deliberately fantastic constructions, and yet, if you read him, I don't know how many of you have read Borges. I think he remains fundamentally a modernist because there is an absolute core of unbelievably agonizing, painfully sincere and authentic personal pain. It's a lot to do with actually Houellebecq's theme. I mean, Borges was a very frail, in many ways, incipiently or already disabled individual. He went blind very early, but he was always a slightly hunchbacked, ugly, extremely cerebral, not at all physical man. He was a kind of masochist who, maybe this is my reading of him, but for some reason I cannot fully psychologically understand. His best friend was a man called Adolfo Bioy Casares. I don't speak Spanish. I can't really pronounce his name possibly, but he was a famously handsome playboy who had a series of beautiful lovers. Borges, until he was blind and disabled and took up with a Japanese woman in his 70s who kind of looked after him and took all his money when he died, probably was an incel, an involuntary celibate, and yet he constantly kept company with his playboy. And this is a central theme of his work. In amongst all the artifice and the fiction and the construction, what constantly returns is this sense of terrible abjection and self-hatred focused on physical inadequacy and unfulfilled longing for women in particular. So this is a core of reality, of absolutely unfictionalized, postmodernly distorted, immediate human experience at the core of. I think it's also even to Nabokov. Nabokov's novels are notoriously fantastically ingenious constructions. I mean, Lolita is the most famous, but I think the most highly critically esteemed is Pale Fire, written around the same time, which is a novel which consists basically of the story of the novel is told in the form of a long series of footnotes, 200 pages of footnotes attached to a 20-page poem. It's a very strange way to tell a story because the footnotes are deliberately misleading. They're written by an ignoramus, a mentally ill individual, very likely a murderer, the man who has murdered the poet. And you have to decipher all this yourself. You have to decipher from under the completely deluded and deranged and fundamentally hilariously mistaken interpretations of this psychopath. You have to try to decipher and extract the story. The story that Nabokov is telling is 4 or 5 times removed from what is actually there on the paper, and you have to invest enormous energy into arriving at an image of what actually happened. This is typical of postmodern literature. By doing that, of course, your attention is shifted over. Really, you barely perceive the story. What your attention is mainly directed to is this world of artifice and the way that stories are constructed and possible interpretations. Your attention is shifted from substance, from content, to the mysteries and the fascinations of form. And this is what happens with in postmodernism. So to finally come to the topic, to Houellebecq, I think, aside from the whole issue of, my jealousy of David Foster Wallace and so on, I think the reason why Houellebecq seized my attention and drew this emotional investment from me and intellectual investment, as no author had, going back 50, 60 years to Kafka and Preuss and Proust, is because he clearly does represent a break with this whole postmodernist mode of writing, this whole postmodernist set of concerns, which had completely dominated the preceding 50 years of literature in all European languages. He must have been particularly shocking in France. I mean, I wasn't living in France at the time, but it would have been interesting to actually observe the first response to Houellebecq, because in France, more than any other country, probably, this postmodernism reached this its most extreme form. I mean, you had brilliant writers, I mean, men of astonishing talent who got bogged down, I would say, in the 60s and 70s in France, in this completely sterile game with forms and signs and the permutation and juggling with various combinations of different forms of representation. I mean, I don't know, some of you may know, certainly French speakers who are listening will know the very brilliant writer Georges Perec, who died a few years ago, I believe, who was famous for many things. I mean, he did write some naturalistic novels, but one of his most famous novels is called La Disparition, The Disappearance. And it tells a story in a way, but the really striking thing about the novel is that before he began to write it, he imposed this arbitrary restriction on himself, or he would not allow himself to use any word with the letter E in it in this novel, which is, as you can imagine, makes writing a novel pretty hard. You have to go through every sentence and eliminate many things you were on the point of saying because they can only be said with a word involving an E. An E is a pretty common letter. And this was typical of postmodernism. And this, again, the story becomes the substance of what you're saying becomes secondary. And all attention is moved on to the form and the whole act of telling a story and what literature is. And so it's the equivalent of what has destroyed the graphic and the plastic arts in the past 50 years. The whole move from figurative art to conceptual art. Practically all art. I mean, I taught briefly at an art college in London in the 90s, and absolutely nobody was doing figurative art. Absolutely nobody was doing landscapes or anything like that, even abstract things. Everything they produced was a meditation on what it was to produce art. I mean, it all goes back to Duchamp and the whole Fontaine thing, the urinal and the art gallery. This whole idea, well, what's that about? Well, you're not meant to admire the urinal. What it's meant to do is to provoke you into asking the question, what belongs in an art gallery and what doesn't, which was wonderful in 1906 whenever we did it. But the problem is it's been done every year for the past 120 years. And it's getting really tiring. And postmodernism, I think, has now run its course, but it was getting pretty tiring throughout that period of the 60s and 70s in France in particular, where people were doing things like this. Every work was some kind of interesting experiment, which didn't really involve telling a story, but involved prompting people and provoking people to ask a question about what it means to tell a story and so on. Now, the last person I'll mention before moving on to Houellebecq is another great representative of this. I mentioned him for a particular reason. Esther Harter will know why. A man called Philippe Soler, who was really at the absolute center of this. He was editor of a magazine called Tel Quel. He died again. They're all dying now. It's really, a man my age, it's really depressing. Everybody's dying. I think Soler died last year too. And he was at the absolute center of the sort of high intellectual Parisian scene in the mid-60s. He was very close friends, went everywhere with Jacques Derrida, Roland Barthes, Jacques Lacan. They all hung out together all the time. Everybody hung out at the Tel Quel offices. And Soler wrote these kind of novels. He wrote, again, to draw another parallel with another art form around the same time, this serial music, or so-called dodecaphonic 12-tone music, producing at this time with similar things. They were, I mean, Soler's novels, they could also easily, the titles could easily have been used as a title for a Stockhausen piece or a Boulez piece from the 60s. His two novels were like Nombre, numbers, and another one was Loi, laws. And they were basically just these permutations. He'd take a text, a sort of 24 pieces, permutate the pieces, and this kind of, and the whole novel would just be this experiment in how far you could switch blocks of words around and yet still preserve some kind of coherent meaning. Unbelievably boring. Nobody has opened a copy of Loi or Nombre, I'm sure, for 40 years. Similarly, nobody has listened to anything that Boulez or Stockhausen composed between 1960 and 1970 ever again. I mean, Boulez, I believe, is still alive, and he's broken out of postmodernism, but well, all of them have actually. He still wants to be very original and not like the old Beethoven and Mozart. So the way he set himself off from Beethoven and Mozart, and this is where they kind of, join hands with globalism, is the whole multi-culti thing. Now, Boulez is now into this whole thing. Let's bring in the music of Gabon, and let's bring in the music of Burundi, and let's dig out some flute music they're playing in the Amazon basin, and we'll mix all that in, and then that won't be modernist anymore. But at least it's listenable. It's not like somebody just running a fucking series of notes through a pocket calculator and coming up, or a primitive computer, and coming up with every conceivable permutation of the musical scale. Anyway, to fight the thing with Houellebecq, I just bear in mind Philippe Soler, though. Finally, Houellebecq arrives in the 90s, and I think I'm right in saying that he must have produced a mixture of hostility and admiration, or hostility and relief, let's say, particularly on the French literary scene. That's probably the secret of his success, because people were just so relieved finally that someone arrived who had made no attempt to do this kind of thing. I mean, Houellebecq is an example of, you probably know the famous Schopenhauer quote. It's in his essay on style, which is that, I've written it down here, the first rule for a good style is that the author should have something to say. Nay, this is the English translation, nay, this is in itself almost all that is necessary. That's quite a big thing to say. I mean, that all you really need in order to write well is to have something to say. If people who write badly, the problem essentially is that they're trying to say more than they actually have to say. This is where you begin to fill things in with flowery, unnecessary verbiage. And I think Schopenhauer, by the way, is even more than Nietzsche. I think he's Houellebecq actually wrote a book on Schopenhauer, I believe. It's not one of his better known books, but he describes his discovery of him in a library in Paris, and his first reading of him, and he really settled on. He's got quite a close relationship to Nietzsche, but the element of pity and empathy, and ultimately, suffering together with the mass of one's fellow human beings and the mass of animate being as a whole, is very much part of. Nietzsche would look on him as a slave moralist, I think, ultimately, and he sees the hard realities. I mean, in that respect, he's Nietzsche, and he doesn't try to drape the terribly brutal hierarchical, the strong and weak structures around the domination of the ugly by the beautiful, the weak by the strong. I mean, he doesn't close his eyes to any of that, Houellebecq, but ultimately his impulse is to reach out and comfort the weak who are lying there beaten and rejected. That's not a Nietzschean impulse. That's more of a Schopenhauerian impulse. And So I think Schopenhauer is his kind of chosen philosopher rather than Nietzsche. But he, and in any case, he definitely, I think, does. I think he has quoted this famous line of Schopenhauer's that the secret to being a good writer, to writing well, is simply having something to say. And this is what set Houellebecq off from just about everybody, particularly in France, but it's true all over Europe, really, for 30 or 40 years before him. He had something to say. And now we come to the crux of the matter, which is, what did he have to say? Here, I think it becomes rather difficult. I don't want to go on for, I think I've already gone for, not an hour yet, but I'll try to keep it down to another 30 minutes. It's really putting the strain on people's attention and try to come to the crux here. I mean, what did he say? Well, I think this is problematical for, I assume I have a right-wing audience here, because he says something which really does take us into a sort of fundamental dilemma, or to use this word that's generally disliked on the right, a dialectic of right-wing thought. Well, let's put it this way. To draw another quote from another author, someone who was at one time when I was in my teens. He was a living author whom I did wait with great eagerness for each one of his books to appear. The great author, I believe he's come back round again now, and a lot of teenagers or younger people are reading him, but he was really one of the great authors of the hippie era, Kurt Vonnegut, the German-American author Kurt Vonnegut. In his first novel, I don't know how many of you read Vonnegut. I think his best novel is his first novel. I think it was his first novel, but it was one of his very early novels anyway, where he was still a science fiction writer and hadn't graduated to becoming a serious literary figure as he did in the 70s. In the 50s, he was still basically a pulp author, and he wrote these science fiction novels. And he wrote a novel called The Sirens of Titan. And this contains the wonderful line. It's I don't know if I'm going to explain the situation here. There's a very science fiction plot about someone being kidnapped and recruited to a big Martian army, and then being lacking discipline in the army. And they had a system in this alien army, or this army based on Mars, of brainwashing, wiping the memory of those who had been insubordinate. And they do this to this man repeatedly, and he leaves behind him each time, knowing they're going to do it to him, a kind of record of his experiences to his future self, who would have forgotten everything about the self he was a year before. And on one of these discoveries, when he discovers this manuscript, maybe on the third or fourth occasion, Vonnegut says, when all this knowledge of who he is and of his history and his situation is when it floods back into his mind through this manuscript, Vonnegut writes the beautiful lines, this manuscript had fulfilled the purpose of all great literature. It had made him his own secret hero in times of trouble. And this, I think, is a very good description of what Houellebecq does. He allows a certain sort of person who, up until his books were written, had either despised themselves or had no conception of themselves as a distinct kind of person at all. He allows them to look on themselves as heroic, or at least as having some kind of dignity, some capacity to communicate their state to other people and defend it systematically and justify it. I mean, the alternative, the person, yet another literary quotation, the alternative to that, when that has not yet happened to you, when you're in this condition of not yet having become your own secret hero in times of trouble, of not yet being able to, of not yet being equipped to do that, then you're in a position which is beautifully described by Kafka, to quote him finally, in his diaries. I've got this written down here too. There's a wonderful passage where Kafka writes, I don't believe people exist whose inner plight resembles mine. Still, it is possible for me to imagine such people. But that the secret raven forever flaps about their heads as it does about mine. Even to imagine that is impossible. And this is a beautiful passage because it first sets up standard image of the isolated individual, the existentially alienated, isolated individual, and then it outdoes it. It leaps far, far beyond its due. He said, well, there's that, but that is not even that is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about some isolation, some sense of utter wretchedness, a unique wretchedness, an absolutely incomparable state of wretchedness and misery that is far, far beyond and below that in some region where no one can reach you. You know, I don't believe that people exist whose inner plight resembles mine, he says, but still, okay, you know, there may be a few people, but that's not even what I'm talking about. I know that on a certain level, there is no one who has this thing flapping, this secret raven flapping around their heads that flaps around mine. This is an evocation of the most terrible agony and misery. And this is ended by the literature that makes one a secret hero to oneself. And Houellebecq's book did this for, you know what I'm talking about, for what we now call the incel experience. Now, there's all this, you know, the difference, what happened in 30 years makes it almost impossible for people in their teens and 20s now to understand this. The whole incel thing has now been talked over, talked to death. There's been 1,000 stories told about it. There's 17 different, 100 different kinds of, there's your vol cells and your true cells and your fem cells, and the fem cells are now claiming that the first incel was a fem cell, and it's all getting so hopelessly confused. But let me just take it from me that in 1994, when Extension du Domaine de la Lutte was the first, Houellebecq, his first novel was published, this was essentially before the internet. I mean, some people like Edward Snowden and a few others, I suppose, were on the internet if you were some kind of IT whiz, if you were some kind of guy who's, you know, one of the few people who was studying computer science in the 70s and 80s, you were already on some kind of World Wide Web. I believe it existed at the beginning of the 90s. But, you know, it wasn't what it is today. There was no real internet culture. This was before 4chan. This was before. So, you really, this in that year, the state of being what is now, you know, the subject of 100,000 internet forums and you know, YouTube videos and you know, the whole careers have been built on the whole kind of thing about, you know, people like Pearl Davis's career, the Houellebecq, this very big account on Twitter for those going into all the ins and outs of I mean, the whole, as you probably are aware, something I've commented on. I mean, the whole meaning of red pill is largely thanks to Pearl, darling Pearl, whom I think is just cute as a button. It's actually shifted over in the past 5 or 6 years. I mean, the red pill originally, in my day, of course, the Matrix first, but the first applied meaning was to the general dissolution, the general breaking out of the general web of illusion and misrepresentation. But in the past 10 years, you probably noticed, the past 5 years in particular, I mean, the red pill thing, someone like Pearl Davis and Houellebecq and these people have more or less entirely seized it. So now it refers almost entirely to this whole question of, I'd say you're getting black pilled, I describe it, but it's now called the red pill, about the absolutely iron hierarchy that exists in relations between men and women. How absolutely every detail, every choice, every preference, every future, every kind of future life path can be perfectly predicted. I mean, you've seen what this Houellebecq guy does. Very ingenious and brilliant. This, you know, these hand drawn diagrams and you know, which to bring in I don't know, like 75 different factors and draw a little compartment for each and balance them up against each other. Here we got the breadwinner factor, and then you've got to bring in the dark triad appeal, and this will give this a value of 6.5, and this one will give a value of 4.2, and we balance them up against each other. I mean, what you got to understand, this is a huge apparatus which allows the person in the condition of being an incel or simply not being able to get sex, no matter, for love nor money, as it were. You just can't, you can't persuade anybody to be intimate with you. You can, of course, anybody can get a prostitute, but this is one of the clearest messages of Houellebecq's books. I mean, you're probably all aware of the stupidity of, I mean, sex havers, normies, would always come back with this when they're talking to a genuine incel. I don't even know what you're talking about. I mean, you say you haven't got $50? You got $50. Look, you go to the fucking brothel, you go to the whorehouse, you pay the $50, you got sex. What's the problem? If that's what you want, it's good sex. No, I mean, look, any idiot knows who has had any reason, who has not been a normie sex haver all their lives. Any idiot knows that not only is it the bed of a prostitute the last place in the world to look for love, it's the last place in the world to look for sex. That's the one place it's guaranteed not to be. You will get nothing there, or in a peep show, or in a massage parlor, or whatever the fuck, that resembles sex. I mean, the question of what is sex? Sex is something to do with reciprocity, not necessarily of emotion or anything we would call love, but certainly of desire. And the one thing that is structurally excluded in all those kind of monetized situations is for reasons of female psychology. I mean, a woman would go mad if she actually reciprocated desire 10 times a day with different men. It would lead to a complete mental breakdown. She has to absolutely forbid herself any kind of reciprocation, certainly of love. There's no question. Nobody's going to fall in love in that situation. The man might, but certainly the woman certainly wouldn't. But any kind of sexual responsiveness is absolutely excluded more in that situation than in any other conceivable situation. I mean, you're more likely to get a sexual response from a policeman who's beating you over the head with a truncheon than you are from a prostitute who's opened their legs for you on a bed in some cheap apartment in a back street. Anybody who knows this, who has actually had to live in that world, had to go to those places and seek that out. And it's an infernal mechanism because you continue to do it. It's like the man lost in a lifeboat at sea who knows perfectly well that the worst thing he should do is lean over and get a cup of seawater and drink it. But he's dying of thirst and he's surrounded by 70 million gallons of water. So at a certain point, he does it. And it's the same with the guy who goes to whores, the genuine incel. He knows better than anybody who's telling him, why don't you just go to a whore? He knows that's the last thing he should do, because going there, he's going somewhere which is the last place on earth which will give him what he wants, but he does it anyway. Anyway, I'm getting off the subject. All of this kind of understanding of that situation, which, as I say, is now massively available through websites and, whole R9K, all this kind of whole boards of sections of huge websites like 4chan devoted exclusively to the discussion of inceldom, and this is all. None of this was available in 1994. So Houellebecq's Extension du domaine de la lutte was one of the first incipient approach to the kind of stuff that HOMAF is doing now. I mean, I think in Extension du domaine de la lutte, Houellebecq was the first to see, for example, a common belief at that time regarding sex was that there's basically one hierarchy. There's money. I mean, this was the dominance at that time at the end of the 20th century, before the arising of our own sort of more race-focused conception of oppression and struggle. Everything was still very much under the sway of this kind of money-focused, capital-focused, Marxist, if you like, vision of hierarchy and domination and power. So the belief was still pretty widespread that there was one hierarchy that counted in modern society, or whatever you want to call the society of the present day, which was money. And if you had money, then you could immediately, at any time you wanted, transfer that monetary success into sexual success. So this is the whole go and get a whore thing again. But it's more than that. It's also the idea that you also actually do become physically attractive to women through the possession of money. Houellebecq was one of the first people to really insist on the existence. You can see this in Extension du Domaine de la Lutte. Insist on the existence of two entirely separate hierarchies of happiness, hierarchies of human satisfaction, between which there was no real translation or transfer. I mean, you could indeed be, as his protagonists are. I mean, they're not poor. One is a secondary school teacher, but one with, I think, quite a good salary. The protagonist of Extension du Domaine de la Lutte he actually cites the salary at one point, I think, and it's really, he admits, it's quite a pouvoir d'achat. It's quite a purchasing power I have at my disposal. And yet he is unable to transpose this position quite high up the monetary hierarchy into any kind of position on this hierarchy of whatever it is he wants. He's utterly excluded from the other fundamental human need. I won't call it love. It's simply erotic satisfaction. The two are not transferable. It's the beginning, as I say, in the mid-1990s of this extremely sophisticated apparatus for understanding and thinking about and talking about male-female relations that exists today, largely due to the internet. Now, I don't know. Look, I have been talking for. Let me just try to wrap this up with a dilemma. I actually had planned to say a lot more, but it's just going on too long. I mean, what we see here when I talk about this Vonnegutian also a Kafka miracle, because I cited Kafka too, of turning this man who up until then had felt like he had this secret raven circling his head, and that he lived a life that was understandable only to himself and suffered in a way that was only understandable to himself. Houellebecq's literature makes this man his own secret hero in times of trouble, which, since other people would also read this literature, also opens him up to a community with whom he can communicate, gives him a language with which he can articulate his pain and his suffering. Now, this places Houellebecq in a tradition which, I'm assuming I have a right-wing audience here. It places Houellebecq in a position and a tradition which is very problematical for us, because it is, when I talk about someone being offered the structures and the apparatus in order to understand their position, I mean, some of you may already have thought this sounds a bit like something like structural racism. But what we're actually talking about here is the word for it is, if you actually look up, I mean, I thought this was a rather, I have this in my memory, but I thought, no, surely this is rather too vague in general a term for what I'm thinking about. But the phrase I'm thinking of is consciousness raising. But if you actually go to Wikipedia and look at the entry for consciousness raising, you find that it refers specifically to this thing I'm talking about. Consciousness raising, the first example of it, is actually in the 1960s. It was the first time it was generally used by feminists. It was used for these sessions that were held in the New York apartment of this particular feminist, who would take her friends, who, again, you've got to have some historical perspective on this. If we're to believe the stories of women anyway, the situation was that women in the middle-class women, of course, in the 1960s, middle-class educated women would really, they'd been married and they'd have very comfy lives. They'd sit at home all day and they just, picking lint off the carpet, and all they had to do basically was just go around the apartment a few times with a Hoover and quietly, gradually, slowly prepare a meal for their husband and put something in the oven so he'd have a meal on the table when he got home from the office and so on. And yet they felt constantly angry and sad and depressed and suicidal and this kind of thing. And they really, maybe we're being a bit generous, but if we believe the story of feminism, and it's fairly plausible to me, they didn't have the apparatus, they didn't have the language in order to articulate the reason they just kept committing themselves to, mental asylums or taking more Valium or whatever the hell people took in those days. They thought of themselves as having this secret raven flapping around their head. They thought of themselves as hopelessly individually sick. And the consciousness raising sessions gave them the language, gave them the set of concepts and categories and scales and diagrams which allowed them to situate their suffering within structures, within some kind of wider truths about society. This was a thing that really was very prominent in. I mean, you could say that it said to them to rebel is justified. They were feeling rebellious, and now they had a justification for their rebellion. I say to rebel is justified is actually a phrase which people can still hear me, right? I'm turning off the mic. Good. To rebel is justified is actually a phrase that to sort of historians of politics and so on, particularly of Asian politics, it's a phrase of Mao's. And there was, in fact, a lot of this going on in the 60s and 70s in China and in representations of China. The best example of consciousness raising that I know outside of feminism is there was a British playwright who now he may still be alive, but he's certainly mellowed since the 70s. I'm talking about some work he did in the 70s here. He's now a fairly bourgeois playwright who writes plays about, adultery in the suburbs of London and so on. But he was a Brechtian playwright in the 70s, and he did a wonderful play. I enjoyed it anyway, based on a kind of a non-fiction book by a man called William Hinton, a book called Fan Shen, Turning of the Body, about the liberation or about Communist Party cadres coming into a small village in Sichuan, some remote part of China, in the 1940s. Or 30s or 40s, and trying to organise resistance against the landlords, primarily, who were, keeping the place under capitalist or landlord control. And there's a wonderful scene, a wonderful example of consciousness raising. It's written in the Brechtian style, as I say. I don't know if you know the Brechtian style is a style where the fourth wall is constantly broken. This is the Brecht called it the alienation effect. The actors would act, and then they'll suddenly turn around and address the audience and say, and now what we're going to do is, or the meaning of this scene is, there's a marvelous example of this where the Communist Party cadre arrives and starts talking to the peasants. He says, well, what we've come here to do is to help you organize resistance against the landlord and smash the power of the landlord, topple the landlord from his position of power. And the peasant, what are you here? What is to cut off our arms and legs? What are you talking about? The landlord is our father. The landlord is the only reason we exist. How can you want us to do this to ourselves? And then the actors turn to the audience and say, they talked for 10 hours. And then, 10 hours later, they suddenly come back into the action, and the peasants say, well, yeah, I can see what you're saying. I mean, in a way, we contribute too. I mean, we help the landlord to till the soil and yeah, if we do contribute, there's no question about that. But he organizes everything. He is the one, he's the center. And they talked for 10 days. And it goes on until finally after 10 weeks, finally the peasants have arrived at the point where, my God, so he's like a parasite, he's like a vampire. We owe him nothing. He's been sucking our blood for generations. So, it takes like 10 weeks to get to this point. And this is consciousness raising. And it has to be said that the incel identity, now look, this is what happens with feminism. It's what happens with the black consciousness. It's what happens with this communist indoctrination from our point of view, the instilling of aggrievedness into a body of people. This is the meaning of consciousness raising, and it has to be admitted. And I think it's thence arises. It's in this way that there arises the ambivalence of the right wing towards the incel identity. I don't know how any of you feel about it. I don't even know if I call myself right wing. I'm much more determined by an incel experience than I am by a sort of right wing experience. So, but many of you, may well feel this is coming to the remark that Partisan de l'Au-delà, I think, who I hope's here, the French-speaking guy, that we had a short exchange on Houellebecq before, a few days ago, and he said when he read Houellebecq's novels as an adolescent, I suppose maybe 10, 15 years ago, he was repelled by them because he found the protagonists pathetic and sad. So, among right-wing people, there is a great deal of contempt, and hatred for the incel type, precisely because it has a lot in common with the black conscious type, the gender conscious type, the gender conscious woman, or the woke, the awoken worker or peasant who's full of class resentment because it's been instilled into him unfortunately, the incel identity does have a lot in common with that. So we keep our distance from it. But I don't know. Like I say, I think probably it will get too complicated. It would take me another hour to go into the dialectics of this. But just to finish on, I don't know. I hope you see where I'm getting to. You could actually tell from the reaction in the 90s again to Houellebecq, who was the first to articulate this particular incel identity, someone who was beginning to come to a consciousness or created a consciousness through creating a body of literature that people could share and share their reactions to. He was actually, and this is what the normies and those who were closer to the system sensed, and this is what really awoke their resentment and their aggression towards him, because he was savagely attacked in the 90s. He was helping to create a new form of resentment, if you want to call it that, the Nietzschean ressentiment. But it's different from most forms of Nietzschean ressentiment because, as we know from our own experience, most forms of Nietzschean ressentiment, most of the forms of ressentiment that Nietzsche describes, feminism, socialism, he describes both of these. The feminist sense of, that they need to assert themselves against men. They've been constantly held down by men and their time has come. Nietzsche saw all this and said it was a form of ressentiment. He saw the emergence of socialism, this idea that the workers developing a sense that, well, I'm as good as my boss. I'm as good as the aristocracy or the members of the upper echelons of society. He saw all this as ressentiment, and he what has happened? Nietzsche didn't live to see this, but we have seen it. These forms of ressentiment, class ressentiment, sex ressentiment, gender ressentiment, if you want to call it that, have now been absorbed into the system. They are no longer impulses directed against the system. The system is built on them. It's part of the persona. It's part of the ideal persona, the model or the template to which the NPC personality, the sort of conformist globalist citizen needs to conform to have a degree of class pride, a sense of being a worker who needs to organize and unionize. I mean, the unions have become powerfully pro-globalist, pro-conservative, pro-system institutions. Feminism, of course, we all know, actually, similarly, the anger of feminists is now very much patronized and endorsed by the system, supported by the system, funded by the system. But this specific, despite the resemblance between incel ressentiment, despite the resemblance that I've tried to describe between the way in which feminist consciousness or feminist resentment is cultivated and molded and formed, and class resentment is cultivated and molded and formed, and the way in which through books like Houellebecq's and principally and first of all through books like Houellebecq's books of the 90s, the way in which a certain incel identity, incel ressentiment is molded and formed. Despite the resemblance between these things, I think incel identity is something very, very different. The reaction of the system to it is quite different. I mean, you saw, to finish on this note, you saw this in the 90s. I remember a particularly savage attack by a man called, those of you who are English may have heard of him, called Will Self. He was a leading public intellectual and novelist in the 90s. And I remember the utter contempt. I think it was some awful TV documentary about on BBC or Channel 4 about Houellebecq. I remember this man, Will Self, who was just everywhere. He was like the British equivalent of Bernard-Henri Lévy or someone. Those of you who are French, Lévy is everywhere. Every evening on the television, Bernard-Henri BHL is invited on to the talk show, and he gives his opinion on this. And he's on the cover of L'Express and the cover of every magazine, the Figaro. He's on the cover, and then Le Monde. Next, he's just everywhere. And Will Self is another one of these people, a complete creature of the system, someone who, just the classic, the son of Jewish academics, himself a Jewish academic, educated in Oxford, and the contempt with which he talked about Houellebecq, and also the terms in which he talked about it. It wasn't just the contempt, it was the dismissive terms. This Houellebecq, he's the little man who can't get laid. Yes, yes, I know about him. Yeah, it's very interesting. And again, this is an attempt to push a character like Houellebecq back into this Kafkan position again, where you rob him of all the tools to understand his personal misery as something that is to do with the structure of society. And I know that sounds full of resentment itself, but the important thing is that I think self-arrogance, this desire to destructurate what Houellebecq was talking about, is a sign that this idea of this thing that Houellebecq is unable to do, the thing that Houellebecq's protagonists are unable to do, and the inability, the incapacity, the blockage that characterizes Houellebecq's heroes. This is something that the typical normie does not experience. I mean, we haven't really fully theorized this yet, but unimpeded access to sex is very much part of the reward for belonging to the system. It's probably one of the leading incentives. It's probably one of the leading tools that are used to bind people to the system. So in this respect, the failure, this inability to access this thing which is, as it there, on offer. I mean, Will Self is not a Chad. I think it's not that that sex to him has become something which is childishly easy to access because of his physical appeal and so on. I think the reason the place that he was speaking from is a place defined by the fact that either to a certain degree, maybe in differing degrees, but certainly fundamental access to the fulfillment of one's creaturely needs should not be difficult if you conform. If you manage to lock yourself into this highly regimented and highly organized system, this horrific, infernal, but highly organized system in which we live, then it's an anomaly if you find yourself in the position that Houellebecq's heroes of the novels of the 90s are in. It's anomalous. If you were locking yourself in the right way, if you were pressing the right buttons or letting the right buttons in you be pressed, you should be, that it shouldn't be happening like that. You should be getting your share. And in this respect, because Houellebecq's heroes are not, whether they know it or not, whether they want it or not, they are rebellious on a fundamental level. And I think, as I say, there's a certain ambivalence on our side, on the right, towards the incels, but the left see very clearly. I mean, you see the way leftist attitudes to incels are. I mean, for the left and for the establishment, every incel is a Nazi and every Nazi is an incel. They see an extremely tight bond between these two things. And I think it's something that people on the right have not yet fully theorized, that the failure to be what Houellebecq calls a belle bête, a beautiful beast, that all these people who are filling in these things all around him, he's looking at them with envy in elementary particles, is, whether you want it to be or not, it's an act of rebellion. It's an act of rebellion which in many ways goes deeper than the overtly political allegiance to a contestatory, a politically challenging power. This is tending to become obscured, I think, in recent months, since November, since the vibe shift, because there's been this great resurgence of possibly in the wake of BAP with his, whole cult of bodybuilding, cult of the body beautiful, and this sort of reassertion of the kind of the high school jock and the Chad and so on, these kind of figures as the central figures of this, we're back, boys, you'll get tired of winning. Behind Trump, it's all the kind of muscular, hold on, am I still here? Yeah, I'm still here. There's been this reassertion of the kind of muscular super normie, had not only one girlfriend in high school, but a dozen girlfriends in high school kind of guy as the central figure in our movement. This has become much, much stronger since the emergence of Trump and particularly the increasing victory of Trump against all odds. But it's becoming harder and harder to see this. It's becoming harder and harder to see. It's as if I think this goes hand in hand with a certain becoming shallower of our critique of the existing order. A large part, with a lot of things that I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear here. The kind of Chad, the muscular, sex-having Chad, who's now become the central figure in our movement, is someone who clearly doesn't have a problem with a very large portion of the existing reality. He's not he's at odds with maybe a certain stratum, the negrified, hopelessly diluted and polluted populations of the Western countries. He wants deportations. He wants re-establishment of white majority countries or purely white countries and all this. But there's much larger swathes of the Houellebecqian side. Houellebecq states it really in the title of his very first book, the first book he published. It's not a work of fiction, but a study of H.P. Lovecraft, contre le monde, contre la vie, against the world, against life. His antagonism, his opposition, his rebellion is against almost everything that constitutes our experience. The kind of right-wing movement at the moment, it sees a very large part of human experience as intact, as really not needing to be altered. They don't really have a problem with most of it. They just want to really just twiddle with some knobs, just change some things, get rid of the globalists, get rid of the gay race communists, move them out, put your J.D. Vances and your Donald Trumps in, and your Pete Hegseths and all this, and everything will be hunky-dory. That's not Houellebecq's view. He's in a fundamental disconnect and sort of this whatever the word is, this relation with the world. And the whole question is, does his antagonism, which is antagonism, he sees all possibility of the fundamental fulfillment of creaturely needs made impossible by the world that we have created. But the question is, many people don't feel that. They see there are a lot of people who do manage to fulfill their basic creaturely needs, even in the world that we've created. And this is the difference between them and Houellebecq. The whole issue, though, is whether Houellebecq's Lovecraftian opposition, this extreme opposition to everything, really lifts him out of the region of the political altogether, and his problem becomes an ontological, metaphysical problem, which is all very interesting. But it renders him a less interesting figure, I think, ultimately, because he's just kind of boring Schopenhauerian, Buddhistic, longer for the beyond. He doesn't really see a struggle that we can engage in the present existing world that will re-establish these the relations that his life and the lives of his heroes are characterized by the lack and the absence of. That makes him. But I am more interested by the idea that he is a political writer, someone who sees that the world can be changed, but sees the extent, the breadth, and the depth of what needs to be changed as extending far beyond what your standard sort of post vibe shift Trump supporter. I mean, the situation we're in politically is already pretty radical in comparison to 40 years ago. People recognize that a hell of a lot more needs to be changed. We need to go a lot deeper than people thought 50 years ago. But arguably, Houellebecq goes still deeper. He's requiring, he needs, in order to render the world whole and healthy and happy again, far more radical action, possibly. But then again, it could be that the reaction he demands is so radical that it shoots beyond the political and becomes just a kind of romantic metaphysical self-indulgence. That isn't actually what I wanted to end on. There was a whole question I addressed in the thing on Substack about masochism, but this is far too complicated to go into. I will stop it there because it's been 90 minutes as usual. So, but we can maybe go into some of these other issues in discussion if anybody wants to chime in.
I did have a question related earlier to when you were speaking about postmodern literature and style and substance. Because one of the things that had struck me before I started reading Houellebecq was when we had discussed him briefly, and you had mentioned that, in your view, he's an author for whom the last 100 years may not have happened. And I was kind of confused initially by what you had meant by that reading it. Because one of the things that Atomized or Elementary Particles does so well is within the story it gives you almost like an abridged history of 20th century France starting from May 68, which seemed like a peculiar observation considering that. Then obviously going into, sorry, there's a lot of outside noise. Going into his ignoring of stylistic experimentation within writing and literature. What strikes me is that rather than writing almost non-fictional account of that history, the framing in itself with the story between Bruno and Michel seems to be almost a radical experimentation with form in itself by doing something so incredibly base with these characters, linking to the greater theme of, how did we get into this situation now where within modernity, where these characters can be base and depraved and, what has broken up, effectively the traditional bond of society that was held together by religion, common identity, even down to things like the sexual liberation and birth control. So I don't know, maybe if you could just expand on your feeling on that a bit.
Well, the first thing, and the second point is more important, and I'll come to that and spend more time on that. The first point, we've got to make a distinction. I mean, I said that he ignored he doesn't ignore, I'm sure he's aware of it, but he chooses not to continue the sustained experimentation with form and meditation on the forms of literary representation that have dominated the previous 50 years or 100 years. That's a different thing from recognizing French social history. I mean, yes, both extension of the domain of the struggle and Elementary Particles are I think I mentioned that they're pitched somewhere between a sociological treatise, and the large, if you're reading Elementary Particles, there are large passages which read like a work of modern French. What happened in the 60s, what happened in the 70s. So what I was saying he avoided was any attempt to. He doesn't really see himself as a successor of Georges Perec or Philippe Soler or any of these kind of experimental novelists of the 60s who were continuing to sort of push the novel form itself to the limits of what it could sustain. Really breaking up syntax and narrative form and sequentiality and chronology. Although I have to say both of them, maybe I'm misrepresenting. I mean, to come to your second point, really, of Elementary Particles, it's true. It is by no means a simple kind of one level univocal, just commonsensically sequential and continuous narrative. It has a very interesting, and as I realized, it's one of its great poignancies. I mean, I don't want to spoil it for you, but the whole pathos of the novel is that it is written from the distance, when all the suffering, terrible agony and suffering, where you can see both Bruno and Michel go through, have been solved. That has been solved and wiped away from the human condition, wiped out of the human condition, eliminated from the human condition by the consequences of Michel's researches. It is incredibly poignant. I mean, I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's not a thriller. But the really, the kind of last line that brings tears to one's eyes is this narrator who we learn at the end. I think we only learn it at the end. Is narrating from 1,000 years in the future, when he says, this story I have told is dedicated to those whose suffering we cannot understand. It is dedicated to humanity, and humanity is used in the sense of an extinct species. Humanity no longer exists. The solution to these problems has been found in transhumanism, in overcoming reproduction and human procreation. I don't know the exact details, but what happens, the society that the world that Michel's researches eventually creates is a world in which people no longer have to go through this agony of, I suppose it's a kind of Huxleyan Brave New World, is it? I don't know. All I know is it's one where nobody experiences sexual rejection any longer. Nobody experiences bad parenthood, the kind of part of what destroyed Bruno's life. Nobody experiences inadequate mothers or fathers. Nobody experiences this sort of fundamentally inadequate physique and body. All these problems are just wiped away. So, but then again, that is not innovatory and avant-garde in the way that these weird experiments of 20 or 30 years before were, because it does draw on it's quite a common history actually. There are many examples of the utopian novel, the kind of the novel in which the protagonist travels into the future and finds some kind of utopian society or a dystopian society, and looks back on the present from the point of view of this society. What is it? Samuel Butler's Erewhon, News from Nowhere by William Morris. There are many novels which have exactly the same structure. They play on the tension, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way, between present day society and some society in the far future, which would have either, I don't know, in which the problems of present day society will either have worsened to the point of where we see present day society in a different light from that perspective, or they would all have been solved. And this is more like Houellebecq's, the pathos of Houellebecq's book. But I mean, maybe I would possibly qualify everything I say also about the first novel. The first novel is actually strikingly, I wouldn't call it postmodernistic, but it certainly rejects, in another way. I'd say that the reason why Elementary Particles won the Elementary Particles was the breakthrough novel, the bestseller novel for Houellebecq, and not the previous one, Extension of the Domain of the Struggle, because Elementary Particles is ultimately more normie friendly, if you like, in its structure. I mean, it's there is this really very effective and very moving structure of the whole story being told from the point of view of the distant future. But that is not entirely novel. It's not entirely new. I mean, that's something that has been done before. The normie mind is accustomed to it. And in a way, it gives the whole thing an immensely neat, sort of tied with a bow kind of structure, which is very pleasing to the normie mind. It's really rounded off nicely. It's not the case. If you haven't read Extension of the Domain of the Struggle, go on and read that. It's one he wrote 4 years before. It's much shorter, but in many ways, it's much of the same material. It's about exactly the same. It's someone very like Bruno, a hopeless incel. It's actually about two characters going to split. There's two guys, one of whom is pretty close to being that, and another one who just really sinks into the depths of it and ends up killing himself. But it's a treatment of that kind of personality, and that is actually you can see that Houellebecq there is aware of one of the things that happened. I mean, one of the things that postmodernism is and all kinds of postmodernism, musical, in graphic and plastic art, it's kind of revolt against any kind of smooth rounding off into a nice, satisfactory form. I mean, these pieces of music from your classical sort of romantic period, or even from the sort of Mozartian pre-romantic period, they're all rounded off in a way that pleases the ear, but also even people of the day must have been a bit annoyed by the kind of neatness with all this. Bam 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 bam, and you see exactly where it's going to go. That you can say, okay, now it has to run through the drum roll again one more time, and then finally, okay, now we got what we wanted. The last big beat, the last big blow on the trumpet, finito, that's it. I mean, the modern discovery of music began with Schoenberg, and the literature that began around the same time really revolted against this, against endings, for example, against anything, because there are no endings in life. I mean, in a way, it was a fulfillment of the sort of realist ambition. It's not the way lives actually work. I mean, we all know from our own lives. It's not like, oh, well, yeah, okay, so this is the finale. This is it. This is the closure. Okay, I was with this girl, and it was great at first, and then it got worse and worse, and we started fighting, and there was this big fight, terrible, where she called the cops, and I got arrested, and that's it, and that was the end. That was a big finale. And she went out of my life and she went away. But life isn't like that. The girl turns up again 2 months. She turns up again 2 months later, and you sort of move back in with her for a week, and you try, and then it goes to shit again, and maybe you do it a third time, and it just never. Life is not like that. It's all kind of and the wonderful thing about Extension of the Domain of the Struggle is that it absolutely refuses anything like it. Hasn't got any kind of denouement at all. It ends with it doesn't end. It's just the protagonist gets more depressed and depressed and more depressed, and he's got this idea in his head all the time, and he needs to go back to this place in the country where he'd been earlier on in the novel, and eventually he does. And the last scene of the novel is just him standing in the middle of a field in this place and feeling exactly as he did when he would be back in Paris 2 pages before. There's no denouement. That was why its reception into the English-speaking world. You should check them out, not to read them, but just to see how terrible they are. That novel in particular. I mean, Elementary. Are you reading? I believe there were two. There were two titles. I believe there's a book which has Atomized on its cover. And then there's another one called Elementary Particles. And I believe, I don't normally read the English translations, but I don't know if they're actually different translations or just different editions. But I believe the American edition is called Elementary Particles. Perhaps it's a completely different translation. And the English edition is called Atomized. I mean, obviously, Elementary Particles is far superior to Atomized. There was no reason to change the title. But that was nothing compared to what they did to Extension of the Domain of the Struggle. I mean, Extension of the Domain of the Struggle, obviously, he didn't have a big name then. And when his agent got some English language publisher to commission a translation and publish an English language edition, obviously the publisher said, okay, well, we'll commission the translation of the book, we'll publish it, but we can't call it that. I mean, what Extension of the Domain of the Struggle? It sounds like a sociological treatise, not a novel. I mean, you've got to think of a different title. And they came up with, I remember seeing it in the 90s. They literally, you're not going to believe this, they literally called this, they changed the title Extension du Domaine de la Lutte to whatever. They literally called it whatever with an exclamation mark, like some crappy piece of Valley Girl speak. And the packaging of the fucking thing was just unbelievable. They clearly gave it to some jacket designer who, it's a small book, but they just, I mean, normally in order to design a jacket, you should read the book and reread it and mull on it and try to come up with some ideas of how you can graphically represent the content of the book. Probably the designer just skimmed through it in half an hour. And he said, well, the guy works in a software company, and he goes out to the country now and again. Like at the end, he's standing in a field and with some cows nearby. So I know what I'll do. I'll do a cover with like a big cow's head bursting out of a computer screen. So you got this monstrosity coming out in England in 1995 or something, called whatever, with a big cow's head with a ring in its nose, bursting out of a computer screen. It had nothing to do with a novel, and it just reduced the whole thing, the dignity and the beauty and the profundity of the whole thing, to some kind of cheap, teenage high school girls joke or whatever. Horrible thing. But I believe there is a serious English translation and a serious English edition now, Extension of the Domain of the Struggle. But no, he is not. To finally, to sum up my responses to your point, maybe I'm being unfair to Houellebecq, but I'm not saying that he's ignorant of or deliberately ignores what had preceded him, but he just didn't want to end up where David Foster Wallace ended up, let's say. David Foster Wallace, I feel, and he was the one maybe who did his best to lift himself out of it. Many people at the end of the 90s, if they continued down that postmodernist path, they got crushed by the weight of, postmodern self-consciousness, this kind of constant awareness of I'm telling a story here and it's not reality. And, I mean, what does it mean to tell a story? Aren't there questions about the very form of what I'm doing? How do I deal with them? How can I distort the form so as to make people aware that all forms are distorted? I think Houellebecq said to himself, okay, yeah, they're all very important questions, but I have something to say here, so I'm not going to try and deal with them. Maybe you have to be more familiar maybe with these postmodern novels to understand what I'm saying, to understand where he might have gone. Oh, the thing I wanted to mention, by the way, and the one thing that's kind of disappointing about Houellebecq, I was going to get around to mentioning this. You may have gotten to this point. I hope it's not a spoiler, but in Elementary Particles, but write something, a remarkably, admirably racist essay about blacks having the brains of lizards and the dicks of cart horses, and how we envy them because we want to regress into this disgusting sort of dinosaurian animalistic state of pure brainless sexual beings. And he takes it to, at this point, a real character, Philippe Soler, the man I mentioned, who was like the king of the Parisian intelligentsia still in the 90s. he portrays Bruno as somehow knowing him, having networked at some point, especially to get to know this guy. And they go and have a cup of coffee in the Café de Deux Magots or something at Boulevard Saint-Germain. And there's a savage scene. I would have thought would have destroyed Soler's career and just absolutely discredited him and made it impossible for him to show his face in public ever again. Where Soler begins by being terribly enthusiastic about the piece, saying, "Oh, Bruno, this is marvelous. I love it. It's wonderful. This vivacity, this absolute fearless statement of the truth, this boldness. I love it very much." And so Bruno at that point says, "Oh, Monsieur Soler, I'm so glad you like it. Then, so when do you think you'll be able to publish the first installment in Tel Quel?" And Soler looks at him and says, "Publish it? You're crazy! I can't publish it. I can't. What this? When we don't live in the era of Celine now, I can't publish this. I would be cancelled. I would be arrested. None of my friends would speak to me again. I mean, I love it, but I can't say I love it." He's exposed as the most utter hypocrite who knows all these things are true, but his entire career is built on saying the opposite. Oh, of course, the race is not real. Diversity is our strength, and you'd think that if Soler had not, after the success of elementary particles, if he hadn't had to resign all his public positions after that, just because of the effectiveness of the satire, then he would have been at least a mortal enemy of Houellebecq's for the rest of his life. But no, as soon as the book won the Goncourt or whatever prize it won, they were at the Deux Magots together, having dinner and slapping each other on the back. It's just so ridiculous. I mean, that's a savage satire. I was very happy with it. A very bold, brave satire on the hypocrisy of the French intelligentsia. But it's like water off a duck's back to these people. They don't mind, being exposed. Everybody knows they're lying all the time anyway, and they become great buddies with the guy who exposed them, provided the exposure had won him a prize. It's just, I don't know. It's terrible stuff. But anyway, I don't know if I got off the subject, the question you asked at the end there. But I think you've got to distinguish between, a crippling kind of burdensome conscience, burdensome awareness and consciousness of the weight of sort of aesthetic obligation and the tradition of living up to the aesthetic standards of postmodernism, which are increasingly crushing. There's that, and an awareness of social history and an awareness of what. There's no doubt that I don't know. I mean, Houellebecq is very often dismissive of certain authors, famous authors in post-war France, in a way which indicates that he just hasn't bothered to read them. I mean, he's so dismissive of them, so contemptuous of them. You can't imagine him having devoted much attention to reading their work. So it could be that he's certainly a lot less aware. I mean, someone like Soler, because he worked with these people and lived with them for 40 years, has certainly read everything by Derrida, everything by Deleuze, everything by Foucault, everything by Lacan, and that's a lot. I mean, I doubt if Houellebecq has. I doubt if Houellebecq has read very much of these people at all. I think he's read little snippets of them, and what he's read he's found to be despicable, and he just probably hasn't really pursued it any further. So in that respect, he's not as contemporary as someone like I don't know, Zizek or someone like that, who's immersed in he's been wading around in this stuff for 50 years, and Houellebecq sort of stands aside from from what we call the contemporary intellectual scene, which is a good thing. My voice is beginning to go, but
what do you think of Houellebecq's depiction of himself in The Map and the Territory, where he just sits in his cabin reading Alexis de Tocqueville over and over and over again until he's brutally murdered?
I didn't, that as I say, the novel was written after 2000. I did sort of maybe begin to read the map of Le Carte de Territoire, but I was aware of that Alexis de Tocqueville, I think Democracy in America is what they call a livre de chevet. I was aware of that. But that particular novel, I haven't. I didn't realize he painted a portrait of himself.
I find it quite entertaining for that, because the thing with Houellebecq is, because he's so sort of depressive, because he's so thick, he has such a particular style in the way that he writes. I find sometimes you can read two of his novels and it feels as though, you know, you could have read one and experienced sort of quite a, like, he risks sort of repeating himself. His style is so particular that almost, unless you're paying particularly keen attention to the themes which are unique to one novel, it can almost feel as though he sort of runs the risk of just sort of becoming wallpaper, blending into the background. But I found The Map and the Territory to be particularly interesting because he sort of consciously diverts from his usual structure of just here's like the main character. They have quite a sort of depressing life and introspective. They're just sort of like Serotonin or all these other novels where it's framed primarily from the first person, from this character, and as their life as they go through it. But I found the structure of The Map and the Territory to be particularly interesting because he goes through the story of this one man. Here's his life. Here are the events that unfold. But then towards the end, it just completely like departs, and then it's just Houellebecq engaged in writing a satirical portrayal of Houellebecq. Someone turns up at his door and gives him a bottle of expensive French wine, and he drinks it in 5 seconds, and he's got 15 bottles of cheap Chilean wine laid out on the floor. I enjoyed just the sort of the self satire. I think is quite unique as far as the rest of his oeuvre.
Well, it's that's generally a sign of exhaustion and almost degeneration in writers very often, where they begin to include themselves in novels, and you're getting back into the postmodern there, where he's parodying himself. I mean, as I say, I have what I noticed. I wouldn't agree with your statement that maybe I'd agree for certain stretches of his now quite long 30-year career. But not. I mean, my own history with him, I say maybe I should have made this clearer at first. There are only 3 novels of his that I've read from cover to cover that I know pretty well, and the first 2, which is the 2 I've been talking about, I've read and reread and know them quite well. And the only other one which I read because it was inevitable, it was unavoidable in Paris in 2015, was Soumission, Submission, which everybody was talking about it, and I myself, I wouldn't agree that all his novels can all blend into each other. What struck me is the really radical difference, and in my opinion, the difference in quality, or at least certainly the difference in interest to me personally, between his novels of the 90s and his work of 2015, Submission. I mean, in Submission, he seems to have turned away completely from what for me is his theme, and the theme that interests me in him, and the reason I love him, and the reason I'm fascinated by him, is the incel theme. What I was talking about, the experience of being unable, not only unable to get love, but unable to get sex. This seems to have fallen away. I'm pretty sure it's fallen away in La Carte de Territoire. I believe the protagonist there is some kind of. Is he not? He's some very.
He's sort of an artist, and he doesn't struggle to the same extent.
He's conceptual.
But there is a sort of the central relationship in that book is between father and son. So it's not really this interrogation of the interrogation of romance. Yeah.
I mean, I just feel that there was this weird period in the 90s. I mean, I heard I'm talking about this kind of British television documentary that Will Self appeared in. I'd read the novels that Houellebecq had written by that time, the first 2, and I was just absolutely baffled. It really was like this kind of awful sort of CNN or BBC journalism, where you look at it and say, "What the fuck universe do they live in? What the hell are they talking about? That's not reality. What are they seeing? How can they see reality that way? And it really was like that. There were a bunch of angry, sort of lefty British critics just getting on camera going on about, oh, well, yeah, I don't know all the fuss about Houellebecq is. I mean, what is it? Just typical French author about writes novels about these handsome young Frenchmen who are smoking Gauloises and just having sex all over the place and just sleeping with anyone and just leading a hedonistic life. What the fuck? I mean, what did someone like take a Bernard Henry novel, Bernard Henry Levy novel, and put a Houellebecq jacket on it and give it to read? What? That's it. These novels were nothing like that. People read these novels in the 90s and saw them as histories of some history of a long series of sexual triumphs. A rich and varied sexual life. I mean, what the? It was just incredible. It's like one of these. So what you're saying is moments where the journalist, someone will quite plainly state something, and the journalist will say, "So what you're saying is," and then say the opposite. So I don't know, but what I wanted to say is I think the novels of the 2000s. I mean, La Carte de Territoire, as far as I can see, and it's also true of La Possibilité de Nil. It's certainly true of Soumission, which I know. They are much more like I don't know if you know what I mean by a Bernard Henry Levy novel. BHL, Bernard Henry Levy, is the kind of the king of the French intellectuel médiatique. He mainly writes non-fiction stuff, philosophy and so on, and political commentary, but he's written lots of novels too. And he's just a typical testimony of sort of what it is to be a normalien, graduate of the École Normale Supérieure, and to have spent one's life living in the fifth arrondissement of Paris and hanging out with Louis Althusser and Michel Foucault and Roland Barthes and all the love affairs one's had, and how one's heart was broken on the Ile Saint-Louis by the Duchess of so and so. Terrible, tedious stuff. And it seems he's Houellebecq. I don't know. I mean, I haven't really given the path. I mean, Soumission was almost one of those novels. I mean, it was a story. It's a story about the democratic Islamization of France. It's about the political parties in order to block the Front National. Now, in order to block them from power, they eventually allow an Islamist, a proponent of Sharia law, to enter the Elysee to become president. And the gentle Islamization of France begins. It's really not so bad. I mean, most people find a way to come to terms with it and actually have some advantages. And the protagonist there is a university lecturer. I mean, the main drama is whether he owes anything to one of his several lovers, a young Jewish graduate student, who, of course, has had to flee because she's no longer welcome in France. And that's the main moral dilemma. But it's implied in telling the story of his dilemma with regard to this girl that he really has never had any problems with establishing good romantic, erotic relations with colleagues, students. He's had many love affairs. Clearly, he's had a successful career. I mean, he's not the kind of radically alienated character that you see in the novels of the 90s. He's much more like the protagonist of a Bernard Henry Levy novel. He's someone who's very much at ease in the sort of haute bourgeoise Parisian society, where everyone's a professor or some kind of editor of a leading magazine or journalist. I mean, I certainly would not, if the first two works and the few collections of poetry and essays that he published in the 90s were cut away from Houellebecq's work, I could pretty much do without it. I'm sure there are many good novels in that period, 2000 to 2020. There's Plateforme, Possibilité d'une île, Soumission, the one you mentioned, La Carte de Territoire. And I've read, I'm ashamed to say, bits of some of them. I've read all of the whole novel, but some of them I've read bits, and they're certainly not bad, and there are many good bits in them. But I think that his real importance. It sounds terrible. I'm sure no novelist will be glad to hear it. That the only really significant work they've done was in the first 10 years of their career. But I'm afraid it is the case with Houellebecq. I think it's partly just a natural effect of corruption, which does set in, particularly in the French literary scene, where I mean, in English-speaking countries, where the practice of literature is really it's not a highly rewarded practice in terms of money or fame. Sometimes, maybe more and more these days, you've got sort of cults around Cormac McCarthy and so on, but generally, it's not like in France. So in France, you become an intellectuel médiatique, and everybody, I mean, everybody in every bar in Paris knows who BHL is, Bernard-Henri Lévy, or everybody knows who Alain Finkielkraut is, everybody knows who Michel Houellebecq is. I don't think everybody knows who Ian McEwan or maybe how many people in Texas know who Cormac McCarthy is. I mean, not that many, I would guess. Maybe a lot of people in Los Angeles or New York or Boston do, but in the places where Cormac McCarthy set his novels, it's kind of southern sort of cowboy states. I don't know. Most people have no idea who he is, but everybody knows who Houellebecq is in Paris. The guy behind the bar, the bus driver. They all know his face. They all know his name. So. And that's corrupting. You after a certain point, it's very easy to just enter into this. Okay, well, I'm bringing in like €1 million a year with this shit, so I just got to keep churning them out. I mean, I've got to produce a novel every 2 or 3 years, otherwise, it's like you're only as good as the last good thing you did. So I've got to keep churning them out, even when I don't really have anything left to say. I don't want to hear from him or anybody. Maybe look, if you are a big sort of €1 million a year earning Parisian intellectual, maybe you do find his novels of the 2010s, for example, enriching and fascinating, full of insights. They're not for me because it's not my world, it's not my experience. I, as I say, was deeply touched because this had a really life-altering effect on me for the reasons I said, reading his novels in the 90s, which really, for the first time, gave expression and articulation to an experience to which expression and articulation had not been given before. So, I don't know. I mean, I believe he's finally finished now. So I've never even opened the last one, Annihilation, or whatever it's called in French. I didn't even know what it's about, but apparently it will be the last.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, it's partisan, is it? Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. I had just one simple question. It'll be quick because I don't know how interesting it is. Do you know about Marc-Edouard Nab?
Who? Say it again.
Marc-Edouard Nab.
No, I don't. What is the third name? What is the surname? Nab.
Nab. Yeah. Nabe. So he's
never heard of the name. No.
Okay, he was close to Houellebecq for a short while. He was a kind of he was famous as a kind of imitator of Céline, and he spent a lot of most of the last I'd say 15 years just having grudges with people of the literary world and writing against them. He was famously a defender of ISIS, right? ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
He had a kind of art gallery in Paris too, and anyway, he was very critical of Houellebecq. I think it was in 2009 he wrote Le 27e Livre, one of his books, and that's where he attacks Houellebecq the most. And some of the ways in which he attacks Houellebecq may be linked to what you said, though I'd suppose he's wrong. I mean, he generally exaggerates his attacks. He's a very polemical and aggressive author. And so he attacks him as stuck in the 19th century in terms of a form, as obsessed with Parisian success, actually, as pretending not to care, but as actually obsessed with it. He attacks it because Nab is obviously a kind of pro-Muslim, anti-Jewish, very anti-Semitic guy. And so there's that angle. And I wonder if he writes about it, but his Nab is kind of a sexually promiscuous and sexually successful guy. And so maybe there's that angle too, but I don't remember reading about it because at the time I read excerpt from the book. So anyway, I was wondering if you had any notion of it, but if you don't, maybe it's just an interesting thing to take a look at.
Yeah, I'm surprised that Houellebecq managed to have any. You say he was close to Houellebecq at a certain point. I mean, he seems the absolute antipode of Houellebecq. I mean, Houellebecq is a great philo-Semite. That's I don't think it's due to corruption by Mossad or someone. I mean, it was always in the Esther Hazer will recognize this. I mean, the imaginary commentary that the imaginary Philippe Soler gives on Bruno's little piece of writing is, I mean, it is a marvelous, paradigm of racist writing. It's almost like it's like Raspail, it's like Le Comte de Saint, that degree of racism in a few pages. He's describing the big pendulous horse-like penis of the blacks and their tiny lizard brains, so the imaginary Soler's commentary on it is this is true racism. This is something where we have to go to Celine. Purely racist as this, and yet there is not the tiniest element of anti-Semitism. There is a tenderness for the Jewish people that's unusual in racist writing, and this is actually characteristic of Houellebecq's own writing. I think it's very much in line with his fundamental philosophy, which I am genuinely convinced I'm not a silly nitpicker like J.P. Bolton's cynical attitudes. I believe the Jews, I said this in the talk on Nietzsche, I believe the Jews are dangerous precisely because of the sincerity and the cogency of their moral doctrine. They are people who are permeated and suffused with the spirit of empathy and pity to a morbid, destructive degree. I mean, we all know that. People don't have a lot of time to this, but it's reading in right-wing circles. I've seen several posts on right-wing Twitter saying, no, stop it with this business about what the libtards do is just kind of empathy gone mad, empathy taken too far. No, it's not. There's no empathy gone evil. Empathy comes from evil. I mean, there's no, it's not that they're not destroying the US out of this violent sympathy and empathy for the poor migrants from the UK out of this violent empathy for poor migrants. No. The real hardcore tendencies that I lean more to the idea that Judaism, what we were talking about, this Jewish principle really is empathy gone mad. It's a kind of a cult of pity, a cult of weeping over the incurable, irredeemable sufferings of the wretched of the earth, the damned and I think Houellebecq fundamentally has some sympathy with that. I mean, there is a moral core to his writing. I think he's a genuine believer it's part of a great Western tradition, and it is, an eminence of this thing is also hated on the right and denounced Judeo-Christianity, something shared by Judaism and Christianity, this mourning and melancholy mourning for the lost and the suffering, and I think that's genuinely there in Houellebecq, and I think that's the reason for his empathy, his penchant, his tending to lean in favour of the Jews. But I don't. But this guy, I'll check him out. But I really don't understand. I mean, if he's, someone who is has an easy life sexually, is sexually at ease, that alienates him from Houellebecq. His Islamism, certainly his anti-Judaism, certainly. I really don't understand how they could have anything to say to him. I'll check him out. Nabe, N-A-B-E. But he himself is not Arab. He's a completely Jewish.
I don't remember the exact details of his background, but I do think they may have had an interest in each other because of different areas of possibility, right? So without going into details on how it maybe have an interest in but I do think there's something interesting in comparing them because Nabe is kind of someone who clothes himself in immoral language, often not actually like knowing language, but he likes to act like he has the right, like he's on the right side. Okay, but he does so in a way where it's very clear that he's much more motivated by a sense of his superiority and assertiveness. So in a sense, there would be a lot he's not uninterested. He's kind of the opposite of what you say of Houellebecq. Okay? In a sense, there's no moral core to have. I do think there is, but there is weaponization of morality. But I stop there.
I think the final word on it, I think his critique of Houellebecq, that Houellebecq's pose as someone who is unlike all the other kind of intellectual and mediatique next to whom he appears on the cover of Express or whatever. He's not like that. He does imply. His whole persona, the pose he adopts. Same TV shows, but I'm not like them. I do believe that I can believe that is maybe, there may be some disingenuousness there. For the reasons, for example, the case I cited, it really did disappoint me that he wrote this savage satire on Soler. I would have hoped that would have made him and Soler lifelong enemies. But apparently not. All through the 2000s to 2010s, they were swanning around Paris together, slapping each other on the back, and so I don't know. It says terrible things about Soler, but it says pretty bad things about Houellebecq. It must be very hard to resist that temptation, particularly if indeed you have been. And Houellebecq, I'm sure, did go through for the first 40 years of his life. He felt all the agonies of probably not so much of extreme poverty, but certainly extreme rejection and the contempt of everyone around him. And naturally, when he was given the opportunity to become the golden boy of all these horrible people, the Le Tout Paris, it's difficult to say no. It's reminds me of an old Elvis Costello song. There was I used to sing along with great bitterness back in the 70s in this, it's called, what is it? I think it's called Angels with Red Shoes or something. He says, well, I used to be disgusted, but now I try to be amused because since their wings have got rusted, all the angels want to wear my red shoes. He said, even better line, something like, that was what closed the deal when they offered me this, they offered me that. But what closed the deal in the end was the angels wanted to wear my red shoes. And I think it was a reference to the women. If finally these beautiful girls, after all, no matter how much he despised their world and no matter how long these people had spat on him, if it finally, he could get just a brief tender touch from one of these unspeakably beautiful girls, soulless and heartless, but unspeakably lovely, then he'd forget about everything, and he just pretend to be one of them. Anyway, sorry, what are you? What I'm hearing noises here. I'm wondering. Got my balcony doors open. I'm just wondering if someone's breaking into the apartment here, but I don't think anyone is. Anyway, I'll see them if they come this way. My voice is. We've been at it for 2.5 hours. I'll be happy. I hope it was. And actually, I thought it went better than I was expecting it would. Because I didn't. Thank God I didn't really get into this stuff that was in the notes on Substack with the whole masochism and the path that Houellebecq does not take, because that would have taken another 2 hours. But I think, what the talk was, admittedly, I spent half of it talking generally about, the history of European literature in the past 50, 100 years, and only the last, 40 minutes on Houellebecq. But I think I got a lot of interesting information in. So, if you want to do another one, maybe in a few days or a week, I might, but rather than skipping from topic to topic, maybe a consolidation and continuation of the Nietzsche one last time, where there were various issues connected with Nietzsche and history, Nietzsche and the concept of truth that came up in the last one. But anyway, we'll see. There's various ways we can go, but I've got about another 5 minutes of vocal cords in me. Is there anybody wanted to ask a question still, or say something, make a contribution? Is there a Houellebecq expert in the house who wants to denounce me as someone who's only read 2 of his novels but pretends to actually understand what the man's about? No? God, these dead silences scare me. Well, if the questions are over, I'm going to rest my voice then. I'll retire for the day. But yeah, we can have another, maybe a second Nietzsche session if anyone's interested in a little while. Yeah.
I heard you mention BAP a few times, and I was curious. Are you familiar with his works? And if so, what are your thoughts on his work and his ideas and his influence? Thank you.
So I didn't even understand who were you referring to?
BAP, Bronze Age Poet.
I presume I am talking to BAP himself, right? Because you got the false Russian accent.
Sorry.
No, I'm joking. Well, I don't know. I haven't bought his book because I don't have a lot of money, to be frank. And normally I download books from, LibGen or something. If it's really difficult, I'd be happy to read his book if I could get it for free. I'm not funding his fucking, Playboy lifestyle by buying it on Amazon. I really can't afford it. But I'm impressed by a lot of what he's blocked me on X because as most of the big right-wing accounts have, because I'm very, I satirize him. I send him up. I keep calling him Big Brain Fag Daddy. But maybe I shouldn't. Maybe it's jealousy, because I don't think he's a stupid guy at all. I think he's genuinely funny. A lot of the things he posts are funny. A lot of the things I've heard him say in podcasts are funny. And I haven't, as I say, because I haven't read his book, I'm not familiar with all the details of his reading of Nietzsche, but I'm pretty sure that, it's a lot sounder than anything I'm going to find in the academic world. Like myself, he's definitely someone whose understanding of Nietzsche diverges very strongly from anything you're going to be taught in a university. He has no patience at how Nietzsche was a Democrat who believed in empathy, and the Übermensch is not actually a real type of human being to be produced by eugenics. So no, he's just the potential that lies in all of us, and we need to help each other develop. Obviously, he doesn't believe that. So, I don't know. I can't say a lot about him. He's got a lot of opinions. I think most of them seem to be correct. I think I was quite pleased when I could still get into his account to see that. I don't know what his position is now on the current topic of the day, the Epstein nonsense, in at least in the US. I mean, he did seem to be becoming aware. I mean, I was aware of this long before he was, but I think only because he didn't really pay attention. But as soon as his attention was drawn to it, I did hear him make some comments saying, "What the fuck is all the fuss about? Well, these girls are teenage whores. They're just like 16, 17-year-old sex workers. What the hell is all the kerfuffle? What kind of longhouse shit is this? Men are not allowed to fuck 17-year-old posies now. This is so that was good. That was I think he made himself kind of unpopular in certain circles with that opinion. I like him generally on balance. Yeah, I mean, I don't like the big accounts generally because they're a kind of cool kids table, and I get the feeling from what I see from the couple that I do frequent, the ones that I do go on who haven't banned me yet, there's a lot of mutual backslapping. There's a lot of this kind of, they got this stupid idiot court jester guy, Carlos, who's got like 100,000 fucking followers and makes these dumbass jokes, and he gets like
he's a caller. His posts as fucking trash, Carlos.
He's trash, is he? What?
Yes, he's trash, Carlos.
Well, yeah, but I don't understand how one of his dumbass jokes gets like 10,000 reposts, and I mean, it's just kind of cool kids table stuff. Like he's the court jester of a little group, and you got Howling Mutant and Captive Dreamer and Curtis Yarvin himself, of course, and they're all going on each other's accounts saying, "Hey, my mutuals, hey, my buddies, yeah, hey, let's get together when you're in New York." And I don't know, maybe it's against jealousy, but they kind of piss me off. It's the internet. Well, in a way, it relates to Houellebecq. Houellebecq was a genuine outsider, and someone who genuinely understands what suffering and alienation and all these things is. But as soon as the hand was extended to him, I mean, Jesus Christ, he had Carla Bruni at his wedding, for fuck's sake. Carla Bruni, like Sarkozy's wife, this kind of supermodel chanteuse. What the fuck has he got to do with her? What possible, but what minuscule particle of experience could those two possibly share? None. It's like they never lived in the same universe. But there's photos of him on her Instagram, doing kissy with her. It's it's a bit like that on X, I think. I mean, BAP's fine, I'm sure, but he kind of moves in this circle now of all these guys who are getting, you've done an interview with the New York Times, and Yarvin is going to have a debate at Harvard, and he's going to recommend you to, I don't know, take up some minor position at Yale or something. It's all such bullshit. But of all of these kind of big shot right-wing thought leaders, I mean, BAP is definitely my favorite. The ones I really hate are the kind of more or less completely anti-intellectual, you kind of chuddy. I can't see BAP like reposting some fucking video of a bunch of wannabe catch a predator pedo hunters, chasing some poor Pakistani down a back alley and grabbing him by the throat and screaming at him, you fuck kids, you fuck. I can't imagine BAP going into that sort of thing. But his friends, Raw Egg Nationalist and Captive Dreamer, I think they might go for that kind of, but I don't know. I don't want to get obsessed with these people. But I don't know enough about the guy's work to say, but my superficial impression is that he's fine, and he's fairly clearly intelligent and well read. And I mean, his general strategy is planned for. I mean, I find the whole thing of sort of, recreating a race of warriors like the men who fought on the windy plains at Troy. I mean, it seems a bit unrealistic. But maybe, like I say, maybe you can just do things. Maybe, why not? Maybe we could reverse 3,000 years of human history, and just we could all be Diomedes and and Agamemnon again. Not me personally, maybe him, because he's certainly his pecs are a notch or two up from mine. I don't know what I can say. That's a bit. I've got no thoughts.
Yeah. The reason why I asked that because as you mentioned, like one of the reason why like his works or his ideas is so popular or interesting to like so many young people in like our circle is that is this aspiration to be like Achilles or like to be like a Hector or like Agamemnon instead of a gay race communism, which is a thing that is offered in the wider culture. And like when the first time they encounter like a bad works, and he's talking about Achilles, like spearing people with the bronze spear, and it's like, holy shit, this is something that I have never been taught at school. And they just get like completely like absorbed in like this, like like classical ideas, and like they started to read Greek, and they start to read Nietzsche, and that's it's a whole thing with the Baptist people that I have encountered.
Well, if they're serious about it, if they're not just laughing about the Nietzsche and laughing about the Greek, I mean,
Yes.
I'm a bit skeptical about the Greek, for example. I mean, you don't just start learning and reading, because of something you read on the internet. There may be people who are genuinely inspired to begin a long and arduous career as a scholar and actually learn to really, I mean, it's a very difficult language, a very difficult and distant culture to understand. I mean, Nietzsche alone is only a century and a half removed from us, and the language is not so difficult to learn as Greek. I mean, that's an undertaking too. I don't like a lot of, I mean, I kind of made friends with this Bovril Gesellschaft guy. I believe he was my friend, and then he suddenly stopped following me. He probably talked to one of his buddies at the cool kids table and said, "Oh no, that guy, you don't know, he insulted so and so," and so he's not a follower anymore. But I was actually on pretty good terms with him for a while, but I didn't say anything. Maybe I would have lost his following if I'd said what I thought, because for the past couple of days, because he's part of this kind of cool kids circle where like, memeing about Nietzsche is good form. It's something that they all do. It's a way of bonding, and it was getting on my nerves a bit. All this stupid kind of dumbass, like, junior high school Nietzsche jokes about, oh, yeah, look at her. Oh, she's got a nice ass. I wouldn't mind getting in touch with her, world of power. You understand what I'm saying? World of power. Willie to power. I mean, this is, they kind of piss it. I think a lot of the Nietzsche study may be that and no more. They skim through a couple of bad English translations of Beyond Good and Evil, and that makes him a Nietzschean. As to reading Pindar in Greek, I mean, look, a lot of kids on the internet are remarkably smart. I have to say that. I mean, they're I'm very impressed by young people I meet on the internet generally. They're, very many of you are people in your 20s, even your teens, are astonishingly articulate. Many of you genuinely knowledgeable. So I don't want to put you down, but seriously, I mean, tackling classical Greek and the culture of classical Greece is, it's not a walk in the park. It's a very serious matter, and a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. If you just kind of scratch at it, and just then yeah, it's better not to do it. I don't know. We'll see. But it's I mean, the whole thing about the zero-sum game, the black and white choice between gay race communism on the one hand and charging across the plains of Troy in full bronze armor with your spear directed towards the enemy. No, I don't think there's such a black and white, one or the other choice. I mean, we cannot roll back 3,000 years of history. Gay race communism, unfortunately, a part of it is kind of here to stay. Or at least maybe a long process of slow, patient sort of multifaceted purification might be possible. But the problem with the right wing as it stands at the moment is, particularly in the present atmosphere, there's sort of the vibe shift where everybody's really buzzed over Trump's victory and so on. People seem to think it can be done in a year, or in at least in a U.S. presidential administration. The entire state of humanity that can be renewed. There can be a transvaluation of all values in the next 4 years, or even the next 4 months, which is a bit nuts. I mean, it's. But yeah, I mean, maybe I'm the one who's I'm being hypocritical and panic, and maybe I'm being just faint-hearted here. Maybe I'm revealing myself as a hypocrite, saying, well, of course, I'm against gay-based communism and I'm for Bronze Age values and so on, but we can't really expect to defeat one and achieve the other. We can't. We can dream of it, we can talk about it, we can declare our wish and our will to do it, but it can't really be done. I mean, that's probably defeatist and a sign of senility. Anyway, look, I got my voice is going. But we'll do another one of these on some topic. We'll see if any of you want to participate in 4 or 5 days. Maybe I'm moving house actually. Yeah, over the next few days, I'll be broadcasting from a few dozen miles further down the Danube. I'm not going to reveal my exact location, not just due to anonymity in general. It's my real name. I don't want to remain anonymous, but my circumstances are kind of weird. But anyway, I'll be 70 kilometers from here next time we speak, maybe. But it was nice talking to you. We'll be communicating on X, I'm sure. If I leave, will the room stay open? If you want to stay here and talk to each other, it's fine. I'm gonna probably won't stay open. I don't know. I don't like to close the room automatically when I withdraw. Should I press end here or should I?
Just say goodbye, and that should be okay. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Mr. Reynolds, for the space, and I'm sure all the people here have the same sentiment of you doing these lectures. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I enjoy them too. Well, thank you for being so kind and patient and open to listen. To an old man like myself. Anyway, I'll go. I'll speak.